Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to another edition of DevSecOps is the Way. Today we'll be talking about compliance. I'm Chris Short, executive producer, host, and I'm going to kick it over to Dave Muir to kind of tell us a little bit more about the compliance bits we're talking about today. Or let him introduce himself too, but.
I'll introduce myself, then I'll hand it over to our esteemed guest as well, who's one of our experts in compliance. But yeah, hey everyone, Dave Muir. I am on Red Hat's strategic global alliances teams. Basically, I'm a solution architect that focuses on our great security partners around things like OpenShift and Ansible. And we've created this monthly DevSecOps is the Way series, which I'll talk about a little bit here. But before I do, I wanted to pass it over to John Osbourne to introduce himself.
Sure. So hi, everyone. My name is John Osbourne. I'm a chief architect for the public sector. My house has some construction going on, so if you hear anything, just ignore that. Yeah, so
Screams.
Yeah, screams, you know, whatever.
Chainsaws.
Yeah. So I mainly focus on bringing a lot of commercial best practices to public sector. So some of the things around people and processes and technology as well. So right now, that kind of the big industry trend is kind of this push for platforms. So we're seeing that a lot in public sector, and there's a lot of ramifications, not only just technology wise, but organizationally, and there's a lot of pieces around that, and there's a lot going on. Usually these things get kind of lumped together with things like agile and cloud adoption and modernization and all these other things. So really what I do is try to help customers make sense of all that and kind of point them towards well-known happy paths, or at least as close to it as there is. So
Well-known happy paths.
Yeah.
I like that term better than best practices.
Yeah.
Yeah, and saying that there's a lot going on, I think, is an understatement, John. Just trying to get a minute of your time during the day is pretty rare. So I think it's going to be a great discussion. Let me just throw up here something quick before you need to know how to share stuff. All right, here we go. So I'm going to move our faces over. Yeah, so as I mentioned, I don't want to share it, I want to present it. As I mentioned, this is a show that's part of a monthly security series. This show is specifically called DevSecOps is the Way. It's typically somewhere around the third week of every month, but we do two shows actually with OpenShift TV. Our next one for this month is actually tomorrow. We're talking with Stigs, one of our partners around compliance, and that's how we're kind of breaking it up. We've got two shows, one more on thought leadership, which is what this show is about, and then another one featuring one of our partners. Alongside of that, you can see we have 3 podcasts that typically drop every month. And what we've done is structured it in a way where there's a security category every month. So we started this in March. It was all about vulnerability scanning as we launched a new vulnerability certification within Red Hat. Then we have compliance this month. April is compliance month. And you can see the rest of the months there. Next month is around really identity access and management. You can always learn more. We've got a site sort of around this and DevSecOps in our ecosystem. You can see it there, red.ht, DevSecOps, the D, the S, and the O do need to be capitalized, or feel free to email us. If you've seen me talk before, these categories may seem familiar because within our ecosystem, within Red Hat, we've created a framework of what we call DevSecOps methodologies and technologies. This framework has actually allowed us to understand and consume all the security features and functions and methods within DevOps and really promote that DevSecOps sort of mantra. You can see over there on the left all the categories. There's 9 different categories, which correspond to our months. But then there's about 34 different methods. I'm sure it's hard to see.
Yeah.
But what that allows us to do is, say, this certain method, this certain technology should possibly be integrated at this step in the DevOps lifecycle. And we could take what Red Hat does, we could take what our ecosystem does, our partners, and bring together a comprehensive joint solution for our customers. So, at the very least, it lets our customers say, oh, I should probably think about static analysis or secrets management, or what we're talking about today, compliance audit and compliance technical controls at certain stages in DevOps, so that I can ensure to have security embedded, automated, and not slow down your DevOps process. All right, so I think, the other thing I just wanted to share real quick is, here's some of our partners that we work with. We have a huge landscape of security partners, but you can see kind of where some of them fit. For example, compliance, which is this month's security topic. You'll notice there's folks like Aqua and Stigs, Synopsys, Tigera, Palo Alto, New Vector. You'll see blogs and the podcast Tomorrow's with Sysdig around some of their capabilities as well. But this, being Red Hat and being the platform provider on the bottom, which is secure by design, but that allows us to see the entire landscape of a DevOps lifecycle with all these different partners, and then we can work with them, work with the industry to understand where they all fit. So that is just my initial spiel to start off the show. In case you haven't heard of what we're doing on a monthly basis. So I wanted to then transition now and have a conversation with John about, his role, a little bit more about what he does. Very interesting to understand, taking, commercial practices, applying it to the public sector. But if you could kind of paint us a picture, John, of what you do overall, like in a given day. I know you do a ton of stuff, but what are some of your major activities for our customers?
Yeah, really starting off with the hard questions. What do you do here? So, it really varies by the day. I have a lot of different job functions, but my bias has always been to be really customer facing. So, I cover a lot of ground because public sector is very large, right? We've got state and local governments. Some are small, some are really large, and we have federal agencies. We've got DoD and Intel and all these things, and it kind of spans a lot of different types of things. From hey, I need to do this at the edge to hey, I'm just getting pretty early, started pretty early on my cloud adoption journey. One of the biggest things we've seen is that as customers start to move into kind of newer ways of working and move into things like cloud, there's a lot of confusion. I think one of the biggest things we see is customers try to kind of lift and shift their on-premise model into public cloud. So they're not only just the technology, but they're different ways of working. So which is a really big challenge, right? Because cloud is just so much different. So the way you do identity management is different. The way you do networking is different. The storage is different. And then the way you kind of work around it, right? This whole idea of kind of the CapEx to OpEx piece is really interesting. But a lot of what I do is help customers with that, make incremental progress, try to change the mindset a little bit, because if you look at public sector, a lot of the compliance and things that have been mandated by law are very static. In a lot of the ways, they've been the same documents or risk management frameworks have been around for 10, 20 years right now. So, try to get them to move into DevSecOps is more of a mind change, change in the mindset a little bit, because you're starting to look at, even making incremental progress. One of the things that we've seen, kind of the failure modes. I think a lot of people, they've heard about different successes in public sector. There's a lot of ones that are very public that you've seen on, KubeCons or, other big conference events. And they think, oh, hey, we can just kind of like take that blueprint and copy it and move it over to us. And it really doesn't work that way, right? Like DevOps in general is a lot about experimenting and trying new things and making small incremental progress and kind of iterating on that. So moving that into the kind of big bang, everything risk management is all done up front, to kind of move into let's get something out the door and focus on improving it over time is kind of one of the challenges.
Yeah. So where do you see the public sector's adoption of DevOps at the moment? I guess, and compare that to commercial industry as well. Are they at the top of the curve? Are they just starting? Where are they?
I'd say there is pockets where it's pretty far advanced, but in general, I'd say we're a little bit behind the curve. And it's a lot of that because of the things I was just talking about, where there is I would say a pretty big groundswell right now to get DevSecOps out the door, in a lot of cases a lot faster, and kind of look at newer ways of working and newer technologies and things like that. But in a lot of ways, we're still kind of set up the old way, where contracts and what's expected and project management is probably the biggest one, where it's very much set up the old way. Like if you go in public sector and you look at the way people do project management, a lot of it's based around burn charts and Gantt charts and things like that, and very kind of older ways of working, and not as much focused on outcomes and just kind of building things small and incrementally, and kind of pivoting if things aren't working and that type of thing. So it's a lot more the groundswell is there, but we're still making progress, I think, as we go. But customers are starting to make a lot of headway, especially with platforms where they can bake in a lot of their policies and security pieces, and let development teams have that kind of API driven handoff, as opposed to more of the ticket driven handoff that we've seen in the past, where you wait 3 months to get a virtual machine and all that stuff. So so we're making headway, but there's your mileage will vary depending on where you are. I think if you look at the traditional like Gene Kim's like 3 ways, a lot of us are still in the first way, which is focusing on just getting things through a CI/CD pipeline. And in general, if you say DevSecOps, I think people initially, DevOps has been around for a while. It's not a novel, but the second you say DevSecOps, people immediately focus on the sec part of that, and they think you're initially talking about. By default, they think you're talking about baking security tools into CI/CD pipeline and things like that. Right. So, but of course, there's other ramifications in terms of engaging people earlier in the life cycle, and there's, because of the way contracts and everything else were set up. I have had customers that have development teams that have never met anyone in ops, and they've never really met anyone in security. So, we're working on. We've had a lot of good success just connecting people together. Some customers are so big that they're asking me like, what's the other teams doing inside, their own organization. So, but people have made a lot of success. I think sorry if I'm just kind of being long-winded here, but
no, it's fine.
One of the things I think that DevOps really needs to pivot to upstream is that, we focus a lot on the Etsy's of the world and the Netflix and the people that are, the tens, right? They're doing this and it's so cool and they're experimenting all the time. But there's so many people that have gone from like a 3 to a 7 because they've engaged security people earlier in the life cycle, and they've engaged ops people earlier in the life cycle. And no, they're not Etsy, but they made a lot of progress. And that's something that really should be probably celebrated and talked about more, because most of us have these massive, mainframes or apps that have been in production for 30 years, and just, moving to a lot of what you read about with DevOps best practices or use cases or whatever you want to talk about isn't always that clear on how to get there, and kind of that incremental progress probably needs to be celebrated more.
Well, yeah, you just can't throw technology at your pipeline and call it DevOps, right? I mean, culture is such a huge part of it. It sounds exactly what you're saying about bringing people together. And that's one of the things we've been trying to say as well with DevSecOps is getting those security people to actually just meet developers, right? Yeah. Instead of through email, like, hey, here's an email. You've got 15 vulnerabilities on this application. Go fix it, right? Mm-hmm. It's trying to get them involved. Although, have you seen, I guess, in the public sector, are security teams large? Is it tough for those teams to integrate with DevOps teams? Is the thinking trying to get more training with the developers around security practices, or what are you seeing there?
I would say that piece, it pretty much is in line with commercial in terms of it being, the famous ratios. It's like, 100, or I'd say in practice, maybe 30 to 1 or something like that in terms of developers and and to security folks, but engaging them earlier, at least in terms of the planning and processing. They're probably not going to come to all your meetings, but that will go pretty far, especially if you look at all the back and forth that happens afterwards, where it's like, the traditional way of doing DevOps or even development in general was like very much ad hoc in public sector after the fact. Like I built an app, I did all these things, and oh wait, now I need to make like a spreadsheet with thousands of rows in it to kind of meet this compliance framework.
Yeah.
And in public sector, we've done, I think, a pretty good job of starting to automate those things. There's been a lot of movement there, and then just engaging the security people to make sure that whatever you're building is actually what they want to sign off on, because a lot of at the end they're going to sign off on the risk aspect of that. One of the other big things, I think, kind of the evolution of DevOps that we've seen in commercial too, but definitely in public sector, is that there was this kind of mindset maybe 5 years ago or so that security is everyone's job, and yes, it is, but a lot of people are just really bad at it, right? So we also, and that's really where a platform comes in, is we can, yes, security is your job, but that's not your day-to-day, and nor are you an expertise in that. So we can't, we need to have some guardrails for you, and that's where kind of a platform can help do that, and it gives the security and operations teams the peace of mind to know that developers can use what they want, but they're doing it inside the confines of approved policies and security things that we know and love and accept and all that stuff. So
yeah, I used to be a developer, so I could say this. I mean, you can only train a developer in security principles so much, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just not their expertise. They're good at building stuff and being creative, but that's why you have like guardrails and controls and things like that to help them out. Right?
Yeah, there's so many pieces to that too. I mean, if you think about even like the shared security model in a public cloud provider, right? I think a lot of people are still trying to wrap their head around that a little bit in terms of what they're responsible for versus what the cloud's responsible for. There's a lot of knobs. You end up having to turn. Those knobs look different on different cloud providers, and so there's some confusion there. But having a platform is a really good kind of way to abstract some of that as well. So if you're kind of speaking the same language, whether it be Kubernetes or Ansible or whatever the language is of your platform, and you're doing that on-prem, well, when you move to public cloud, just having that kind of similar language can help, I think, reduce some of the complexity and cognitive overhead of kind of moving and using different environments and things like that.
Yeah. So let's chat about regulatory compliance and yeah. Here come the acronyms.
Real sexy topics.
Beware. Well, tell us, I guess. And I know, regulatory compliance, some people cringe at it, but it was a way for companies to be able to, meet guidelines easier instead of sort of guessing and having to do hundreds of tests over and over and over again. They can just say, hey, I'm PCI compliant or whatever. And then that would be a common standard for everybody to talk to. What are some of the more popular compliance frameworks that you see in the public sector?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think so. Right now, there are a few, and I'll talk about them in a second. But we've seen actually a lot of commercial companies using public sector frameworks as well. So I don't think public sector frameworks are just for public sector. Even I've talked to car companies in Germany and other Sweden, other places where they want to sell to the U.S., so they have to say that they're going to use some of these certain standards and so forth. But the biggest one that's been around for about 15 years now is there was a law passed called FISMA Act that standardizes kind of risk management framework, and it was largely based on-prem because it was 15 years ago, right? And so it goes very much up and down the entire stack from your application and encryption to how am I physically protecting my data center for smash and grab type scenarios. And so about 9 years ago or 10 years ago, they passed FedRAMP. So if you're familiar with FedRAMP, that's basically risk management framework for public cloud providers. And so that is awesome because, with on-prem, you go through this whole, or public cloud, you go through this whole ATO process. If you've heard of the term ATO, it's authority to operate. It basically says that your system can have production data in it. And so with FedRAMP, it basically says, hey, if you build your app in the public cloud and it's FedRAMPed, well, then, you don't have to worry about the smash and grab. You don't have with the disks or any other service that you're running on that's FedRAMPed. You only have to go through the ATO process for what you're building on top of it. So that reduced the lift for a lot of people in public sector. So that's been helpful. A lot of other things that you've heard about, like you've probably heard of Stigs, like the operating system has a Stig, or your middleware platform has a Stig.
DISA,
all the DISA stuff and FIPS, and they've released. I got to work on the Kubernetes SRG. That's kind of like the upstream for the Stig, and there's all sorts of stuff that's happened. A lot of those just kind of roll into these kind of two risk management frameworks and processes. But we've seen things like CIS, just like commercial companies are using, in a lot of cases, what comes out of public sector, we've seen vice versa. So we've seen kind of the CIS Kubernetes benchmarks and other things come down and now into public sector. People are asking about these other standards and things too. So there's a lot that's out there, but the biggest one that's mandated is FISMA, and then which is the kind of the NIST RMF, and then after that, FedRAMP for people using public cloud. So
how do those audits usually work? Is there an external party who comes and collects, your documentation, things like that, or how does that process work?
Yeah, so the normal ATO process, you have a security officer who's going to basically at the end, they're going to accept risk and sign an ATO. And the whole process is a lot of paperwork generation. It's POAMs for what vulnerabilities you have, and thousands of lines in a spreadsheet over all these different controls and knobs you have to turn and all that. So traditionally, that process has taken anywhere from 2,000 to 10,000 people hours to get that out the door. So it's been massive. Sometimes you build something and it's taken maybe up to another year to get it through the ATO process. So we've been working on for a while on ways to automate a lot of those checks, reuse some of the security. There's been all sorts of kind of fancy terms that people have thrown around, like ATO in a day and other stuff. But really, these things have been just a way to automate a lot of the paperwork process and a lot of the controls that have been turned. With OpenShift right now, one of the cool things that we shipped was this compliance operator, which will make sure that you're already, basically your OS is stigged or gone through, the CIS Kubernetes benchmark and other things by default. So you don't have to worry about necessarily turning all the knobs anymore. It's a lot of, engaging people and then maybe some of the documentation around it. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but I'd say every year we make pretty good incremental progress to making the lift a lot lighter for people. But it is a people process. That's definitely one of the things as well. So, I've seen ATOs going through in a day, but I've also seen them take 2 years, right? Because it's people. So it's, it's a process that you're supposed to kind of accept the risk, but, some people, risk is not, it can be subjective term. So.
Yeah. So where do you see the most automation? Is I can imagine there's obviously some automation you can do in the build process, but that's just not the only point, right?
So, I think once we actually saw, even going back to before Kubernetes had fully won out, just going back early into the Docker days, I think one of the reasons why Docker became so popular was this whole idea of building APIs on top of Linux containers, and you could ship out your environment, and it was your container image had your application and all the configuration that it needs and the environment variables it needs to run, and so that was pretty powerful in itself. And then so I think once customers started looking at just containers, they thought, hey, this is actually a good framework for me to improve on my existing CI/CD process, which is like Jenkins and a bunch of Bash, let's be honest, right? Maybe a couple of Jenkins plugins. And so there's been this kind of push for a while to automate some of that. So usually the first step we see is, if they're going down the container path, it's container image scanning. right? And so there's lots of good tools out there, StackRox, Twistlock, Anchor, Sysdig, and so forth. That whole space has been very noisy, and also, if we're also being honest, a lot of those scanning tools produce different results. And so I think kind of the next iteration of that is I want a redundant scanning tool. So in a lot of cases, customers have 2 scanning tools. And one of those might be something from Red Hat. So, we scan our own base images, but not the apps on top. And that's really where all of the, like you came from Black Duck, right? Which is now Synopsys, right? And they do a great job scanning all the open source components that you would pile on top of, our base images and so forth. But then there's a lot of customers who like to do static analysis tools. In a lot of cases, development's done by contractors in the public sector, but some of the operations teams might be govies, so the security people are always in govies. So, they want more checks in terms of, hey, make sure the developers don't have open ports, aren't doing those types of things. So there is quite a bit of static analysis that's done. And then just kind of iterating on that, right? Then customers might look towards the runtime once they have they have the CI/CD part down. Then they look towards the runtime. I think the challenge for a while, and it still kind of exists, is that a lot of the tools that we've always used to do things in virtual machines isn't really set up in a lot of cases to use those same tools in public cloud. So, a lot of scanning tools, and companies have pivoted, I think, in a lot of ways. So the answer is gonna be different for every solution. But in the early days, it was like, we have to run this tool, and the tool didn't do anything. So like you scan it and it's like, hey, it's got 0 findings. And it's like, well, actually the container image isn't even mounted to the root file system. So it didn't even see anything, but okay. And they're like, well, we had to do it. So it looks good. So, you have kind of that evolution, but now we see a lot of, you put up the slide in the beginning, a lot of the partners now have operators where you can install it and it's going to run as a daemon set and those types of things. And that's been great. And there's been a push, and we did a lot of edge stuff in public sector as well. So in some cases, customers are, not even looking to run just Kubernetes. They're running to it. They're going to run Ansible. They're going to run Rail for Edge or Podman. Just want to run a few containers in an edge scenario. But of course, edge is different for everybody too, right? Some edges, can run a full-blown cluster with, some of these pizza boxes they make now are crazy. You can have you probably put 20 node cluster on 2 pizza boxes, because some of them just come so they always say Moore's law is going to run out, but it never seems to do so. But yeah, that's kind of the iteration of it, is the scanning, redundant scanning, static analysis, then looking to do some of the runtime stuff on top of it. The networking component as well is pretty important. People want to make sure that limiting the blast radius, because we're using a platform, a lot of times it's multi-tenant. There's usually not a ton of single tenant use cases in public sector, but at scale too, I've been pushing for multi-tenants. So we're not getting too big with, having 20 different projects on a platform. Mm-hmm. We're kind of breaking things off into kind of a middle ground where it's multi-tenant, but we're not going to all move at the pace of the slowest tenant on the platform. So that's mostly the evolution of it. There's obviously organizational things that need to change around that. So contracting, the boring stuff is really kind of where we're at still with some of these things.
Yeah, you're right, by the way, around scanning and the vendors coming up with different results. It's more of an art,
It is. I mean, I don't blame them. If you look at where they're getting their data sources from, they're like, hey, we got this one came off the Python notes page from 2014, and this one came straight from the vendor as a vulnerability, and they just get their data sources from all over the internet, right? And so obviously, when you do that, it's not like everyone's looking at the same authoritative authority. In a lot of cases, what vulnerabilities in an Apache Commons library, who's the authoritative source for that? You know what I mean? So, it's.
And even Red Hat has probably 5 different sources where you can pull security information from. And that's one of the reasons, or that's the reason why we created that vulnerability certification program for those partners. I'm going to plug last month's topic when we talked about this, where, there's a set of requirements for these scanning partners to consume the right security feed. and also display Red Hat data alongside their data on Red Hat packages, right? It's sort of first in industry. We're hoping the other distros follow suit, which would make results a lot more, a lot similar between scanners.
Yeah.
Because, as you know, customers will look at a scanning report and then they'll look at what Red Hat says about it, and it's like, wait a minute, they're totally two different things.
Yeah, no, it's actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's actually, I had, you know, maybe I just put that in the back of my mind, because I think I have a lot of scar tissue from that issue. But for those that aren't familiar, you know, I think what Dave's touching on is the way a lot of scanning tools work is they look upstream to where there's, you know, what versions have a problem, and then they do an RPM check or something inside of a container and realize, oh, well, you're using, you know, Python, you know, or, you know, Python 2.7, and you have this vulnerability. And that works for every vendor except for Red Hat, because Red Hat's like the only vendor that backports in a lot of cases fixes into older versions. And so that causes a lot of problems where scanning tools will say, okay, well, you know, you have all these findings, and it's like, well, no, you actually have to ask Red Hat for what's a finding, because we're backporting stuff, and you know, you're not going to, it's not the same as the upstream. So that's been a challenge. So there's definitely kind of an educational aspect to that as well. So we've seen that in the oval v2 piece for, you know, for people who aren't paying attention. So, you know, we've had this oval feed for a long time, which basically tells you just what you need to fix. Right. And if there's a patch, it tells you that, you know, you need to go patch your system. And, you know, we put out this v2 feed to help clarify some of those pieces as well. It's more like an enhanced feed to kind of solve some of these components upstream. But
yeah, in that version, I guess the version 2 came out, a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago. They're continuously updating it. In fact, they, I think just today they released an enhancement that will help our scanning vendors consume what they're calling the unpatched vulnerabilities. So not only does Oval put out fixes, well, here's the fix, but they also say, here's what's currently affecting, and that's not patched either. You know, it's affected, or we decided not to fix it because it, you know, there's no impact, or another reason that it's still a vulnerability in the system. So yeah, the teams are continuously updating that based on a lot of the feedback we got from the certification program, which is nice to see. And so I see a light at the end of the tunnel, you know, for these scan results. But it's been good so far. We've got 3 partners certified and about 5 more working towards certification. It's not easy for these scanning vendors. It hasn't been easy for Red Hat to make it work, but it's worth it, right? Yeah,
it's been a challenge for customers because there's a lot. When I start off, I think I said there's a lot going on, and there are, because, you know, a lot of times people look to adopt technologies like Kubernetes and like, you know, Ansible or whatever it is, in conjunction with this kind of public cloud piece, which I talked about is, you know, a lot of things are different there. And then they're like, hey, well, it's also a good time to let's fix our CI/CD problem and these other things. And a lot of these components have noise in their own learning curve. So just getting incrementally started on it and getting something out the door is, you know, what do you focus on first is kind of the challenge with that.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, and there's questions in chat that are coming through, right? Like there's this one tool that Netflix released called RiskQuant, and like, you know, where do you get started, right? Like, how do you even start assessing risk?
Yeah,
that's one of the questions in chat. Like, how do you even open the door to beginning this process?
Yeah, it's hard, I think, and that's actually in general. I think regardless of which risk management framework or compliance in general is, you know, compliance is almost like the minimum table stakes to me. It's great, but the failure mode is when you stop looking at it as a way to kind of think independently about what you're doing. You know, DevSecOps is a tool. I think it's a strong tool, but, you know, we're trying to solve larger business outcomes with it. And so you need to work backwards from that in a lot of cases. And, you know, if you have a bunch of vulnerabilities that's, you know, on a system that's on an embedded system, and it's not even connected to anything, you know, it's on, you've probably heard of like Windows 95 is on a fighter jet or something like that, right? And it's like, okay, I'm sure there's all sorts of patches and vulnerabilities that are out there, but you can't access it unless you physically touch the board, right? So, it's not like you have a Windows 95 machine exposed to the internet. So, compliance framework will say that's the biggest travesty of all time. Maybe it is, but, you need to kind of think that, it's on an embedded system. There's a lot of independent thought and risk management piece around that I think, you have to kind of wrap your arms around. And so, compliance is such a heavy lift that I think by the time people are done with it, they think, okay, well, this took such a long time and there's such effort, we're done. You know what I mean?
Right.
But you have to,
and really it should be automated constantly.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. And, especially with a lot of risk management frameworks, that's why we don't upgrade pieces either, right? We get a risk management framework out the door. And so,
I've seen
a lot.
Yeah.
So,
a lot in some very scary scenarios, like
very scary
trials and things like that. Right. Like,
absolutely.
We can't upgrade Windows NT 4 because if we do, we got to go through the entire certification process.
Yeah. The whole certification
again.
process.
And it's like, wait, you're running an NT 4 VM?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. So, I mean, what we're looking at right now, and I think what NIST and some of these other bodies are looking at right now is, past, the first way, right? The moving into the second way and the third way, using kind of Gene Kim's three ways, we're getting more feedback and moving into more continual learning and so forth is, we talked about the automation. It's going to be now more automation of the compliance, not just the scanning, but all the documentation pieces around that. Like, what does your architecture look like? Well, that's great. You had the architectural diagrams from the first day, but we know how production systems go over time, right? There's a lot of toothpicks and duct tape that ends up holding the systems together over time, right? And so are your architecture diagrams up to date? Can you reproduce those? Then kind of moving into the monitoring and observability aspect to it. So I think a lot of the kind of forward-leaning, security people in public sector are saying, well, if you can automate all your documentation and automate these other pieces, and you get to state of maturity with your monitoring and metrics, and you have some of the third-party tools like maybe a Twistlick or Anchor or Black Duck doing the scanning, and maybe like a Sysdig doing all the runtime stuff, whatever it may be, then you can go ahead and move towards what you would hear like a continuous ATO or something like that, where you can update all these components nonstop, and you're not necessarily worried about a point in time ATO with documentation from last year with certain versions that are static. Now you kind of moved into this. Now I can iterate really fast. Once you get into kind of the second way, that's really more optimized for developers, where they can start pushing their code. The platform has all the policies and scanning and security pieces around it that you can move at the speed of or the tempo that you need for your organization. And we are seeing some of that now, which is pretty exciting, but it's taken a long way to get there. And of course, we still have a lot of ways to go too. So.
Yeah, and I want to sort of go back. You mentioned OpenShift and some of the features like the compliance operator and FIPS enabled, right? So are you seeing a lot of time saved in terms of ensuring like a Kubernetes distribution is compliant just because OpenShift out of the box by default has some of these things already enabled? You've seen a lot of that?
I'd say the biggest thing is it gives people a warm and fuzzy feeling, right? So, they know Stigs, they know the OS, and if you tell them, that Red Hat Core OS it's immutable, it's treated like an appliance, it's the same bits as RHEL 8. I think the latest version is the same bits as RHEL 8.3, and we can give you your Stig in an automated way. Well, that's a huge lift for the customer. If you talk about undifferentiated heavy lifting, it's and toil and those things that get thrown around a lot. For compliance, a lot of that's just incredibly tedious. Permit root login equals no, and I got to change this file, and I got to do this, and
oh gosh,
all that.
I remember those days doing that by hand. Yeah,
doing all those days by hand. And so we felt that, and so that removes a lot of the toil for customers.
Yeah.
Things like you've got SC Linux and other things that are built into the platform by default, but now you're also going to automate a lot of the stuff that they're going to have to do no matter what technology that they chose, because they have to do this compliance framework. So that's a pretty big thing for customers, and it's been it's been one of the more exciting things about, we still, as far as globally geos go, public sectors, I think percentage wise, we still have quite a bit of customers on 3, but for the customers that have moved to 4, the feedback we've gotten has been pretty amazing around, the not having to manage the OS and have it be more of an implementation detail, and having some of the compliance piece is a little newer, but just in general having a lot more of the undifferentiated heavy lifting. I mean, we just talked to a customer that is running one of the largest apps that I think it's actually the largest app at the organization, and it's a financial app, and it's very public. A lot of people that are watching have probably heard this app, especially if you've ever looked at public filings and things like that for public companies. But that's all running on a cluster, and they've got like two admins running this like really large cluster, because a lot of it's just kind of built. A lot of the undifferentiated heavy lifting is built into the platform, and now they're going to be using things like the compliance operator to automate a lot of the rest of it. So it's definitely exciting. We still have a lot of customers on 3, and we're trying to do a lot of there's quite a bit of social engineering and architectural stuff and education that's required. So we're still doing a lot of that, but the customers that have moved to 4 or are new customers, the feedback's been pretty incredible so far.
That's good stuff. And you mentioned other Red Hat products, right? How are some other Red Hat products involved in compliance auditing, compliance controls outside of OpenShift?
So historically, in terms of a lot of the Stigs and so forth, it's been Red Hat Enterprise Linux and then JBoss CAP on the middleware side. But of course, we've iterated over time for that, and now we've got Stigs for Ansible, which has become just incredibly popular because it's a lot of it's like the glue for enterprise, right? So it can talk to almost any system, and in a lot of cases, it's become kind of the de facto standard to talk to things like storage and networking devices and things like that. And then, for a lot of customers that are looking to do more things at the edge, where they're not necessarily going to have telemetry enabled and all those other things, and have kind of a smaller form footprint. They're looking at just using RHEL, and they might have OpenShift at the home base, right? And they might have a CI/CD factory there, but the container image that's going to get spun out is actually just going to run in a plain old RHEL instance. Now we're looking at RHEL for Edge, which is pretty cool. And it might just get started up by plain old systemd and Podman, and we've seen that in kind of Ansible automating some of that as well. So that's been kind of a cool use case as well. But we're also using the BU's working on some smaller footprint OpenShift. So I think pretty soon we'll be able to give people kind of both options, which would be pretty cool as well. So
very nice.
Yeah, no, the compliance operator is really awesome, and folks are asking, "Oh my gosh, can I get this working at in my bespoke Kubernetes cluster over here?" And it's kind of like, well, the docs say, sorry, this only works with RCOS, but in theory, if there was rules for it and we built them out, we could have it for RHEL, we could have it for insert Linux distro here kind of deal. And I feel like a lot of the compliance bits around Kubernetes are like so new and are going to have such a hard time keeping up. How do you think that's going to go in the future?
Yeah, I think that's a challenge, because you absolutely have to kind of have somebody that's evolving with the technology. And so if you look at, Kubernetes is on a time box release cycle. So every 3 months it ships out a new version. And there's been changes in Kubernetes. If you look at ephemeral containers and these other things, and there's a security implication with running new software, right? And so and a lot of times, like a Kubernetes benchmark you might be looking at the older version, or when a new version of Kubernetes comes out, the Kubernetes benchmark might not come out right with that. So I think having a vendor, and this is probably a shameless plug, but I think having a vendor like Red Hat that's got a kind of a strong security DNA to vet a lot of those things, and we're going to probably shield you from a lot of that noise. And then also we have multiple layers of protection turned onto the platform with things like SE Linux and security context,
yeah.
which has been really powerful. And
what is it? SE Linux has put all those big, bad, nasty, gnarly Kubernetes bugs, and SE Linux just stopped them in their tracks for the most part, right?
Yes, I've got this. I think I got it from Dan Walsh, but there's been essentially 5 CVEs for container breakouts, and SE Linux has stopped all 5 of them. So it's all about multiple layers of protection to us, but SE Linux is a really strong layer of protection, and even just having that managed for you by the platform is really strong because historically people have turned off SE Linux even in environments where they really shouldn't be, because we're being honest, it's hard to use. But the good thing is you don't have to know how to use it with with a platform. It's just kind of shipping it for you and tuning it for you and things like that. So there's a lot of value add from there, just in terms of giving people more secure out of the box profiles, but then just avoiding some of the undifferentiated heavy lifting, not just technology wise, but security tuning and compliance framework wise. So,
I mean, it's a bear to manage on just an OS, right? Like when there's other stuff running on top of it. Yeah, it's interesting, but we all have to remember that like kernel components make up containers. SE Linux protects kernel components, so it's one of those things where it's like there's a happy relationship there.
Yeah, I think people always got confused because the original, the original Docker container architectural diagrams that went around forever had, the box was like, here's Linux, and then here's my container on top of it. And, I think it made sense for architecture diagram, but, I think people got confused with thinking that it was something just completely different than Linux at first. But yeah, these things are all just kind of enabled by the platform, that you're running on in a lot of cases. So.
I was going to say, as a Christmas gift for all your viewers, Chris, December is platform month for security. So we're going to be hopefully diving into things like SE Linux and OpenShift platform security, which I think will be very cool. As we go along. But
what does Red Hat offer kind of out of the box as far as help securing clusters, right? Like, I know we try to be Switzerland. I know we try to do a lot of, neutral things, but can we actually help people secure things other than OpenShift? I mean, I know we can, but do we? Is that a standard practice of ours, I guess?
Are you asking from a compliance perspective?
Yeah, from just from a compliance perspective, right? Like if someone has, let's say, 4 different clouds they're running on, chances are they're going to have some bespoke thing or some cloud service that they're trying to work with, and there's a compliance layer there as well, right? How do we manage that, right? Like if I'm using like RDS, for example, in Amazon with my OpenShift cluster, how do I, say, okay, yeah, everything's good with AWS and OpenShift. Does that compliance operator know AWS to an extent to where it's like, yeah, this is misconfigured, try this instead kind of deal? Or
I'm not sure, John, you might
so I mean, I think we do have a consulting team that's very strong, and in a lot of cases their main focus is not necessarily end-to-end security around everything you're doing in your enterprise, but their main focus is, how can I build this in the most secure way in the context of Red Hat products? Because anything outside the scope of that becomes just too too unwieldy and probably unrealistic, right? And so they know how to make our products secure, and they know how to make our products secure in the environment that they're in. But once you start going out with there's like 300 Amazon services, 150 Google Cloud services. So no, they're not expert in everything, but they know how to put things in context there. And then our consulting too is a little bit more set up to be an accelerator for you or for other groups you're working with as well. So a lot of times if we're working with customers, there's other traditional SIs like Raytheon or Deloitte or whomever, right? And so SAIC and Accenture and Lockheed and all these people. So in a lot of cases, we're enhancing other people that are doing those things as well with kind of, hey, this is what we've seen. This is a best practice. But for the customers, having our consulting team's awesome, because not only have they done this in a million other places, but they have reached back to all the engineers at Red Hat and other things that you just wouldn't have access to otherwise. So that becomes pretty invaluable. And then of course, like internally, we have SME lists and all sorts of internal shared documentation and other things like that. So that's been really helpful. But they build a lot of their source solutions for things right out in the open. So Red Hat Consulting has their own GitHub repo and stuff that's actually got some pretty cool stuff on it. That's worth plugging around. And one of the other things that they've been building is this, I can't believe I'm just now talking about it, is this kind of software factory piece called Red Sword. So it's in the Department of Defense. They had built out this kind of reference design for DevSecOps a while back, and they're working on a version 2 of it right now. But Red Hat built out this open source. And one of the things that we were seeing was customers, in addition to all the compliance components, was they were spending a lot of times not focused on their app after they moved to Kubernetes initially, because they'd be writing all this glue code, right? And so, think about the DevOps engineer. A lot of times it's writing like glue code or doing all these other things, especially initially. And, that's a lot of it, what it was like, how do I take all these scanning tools and components and kind of plug them into Jenkins or Tecton or whatever they're going to be using as their backbone. And so one of the things that we did was, Red Hat actually hired people out of pocket to help build this kind of software factory component by default, where either you're going to use it or you can use pieces of it. It's all public. Someone could put that, if there's a show notes or something, we can put that in. But it's been one of the things that we've been working on, and we're engaged with, I think, 4 customers right now with having them leverage that. So yes, you can build in a lot of the scanning pieces and all the static security tool and all the glue code and stuff that you would need around it, as opposed to kind of building all that yourself, because we want customers to fill up the platform with apps, and we want them to finish their fulfill their mission capabilities, and not just worried about all this kind of toil and glue code and other stuff and documentation gen work that people have done historically in the past, and non-value add stuff.
Very important.
Cool. So I had a question for you, John. Thinking about compliance in the pipeline, we've talked about different integration points, CI/CD. We've talked about scanning a running container. But if we think about compliance technical controls during that pipeline, where have you seen those implemented? Like, have you seen admission controllers stop pods from starting because of compliance issues, or maybe even as something's running, maybe an automatic remediation type of control? Have you seen those?
I think a lot of it's like basic hygiene in the beginning. So, and even in the middle stages. So, it's a lot of, let's get network policies set up. Think of the traditional things you would do on premise with firewall rules and things like that, where now you want to make sure that you're at least doing those in some sort of cloud native way. So in having good role-based access control, identity management, people ask about things like certificate rotation, those types of things, network policies. It's not crazy stuff. It's just like good hygiene things that you should be doing. And that's usually where, we spend the most time, is kind of setting those things up. Some customers are already starting to look at newer paradigms and ways of working, like GitOps and things like that, where, your workflows are actually starting to change, built around those things. But I would say, a lot of it is just kind of the good policy management. Some of the more mature customers that have been around, been doing this for a little bit, are still looking to like policy around multi-cluster provisioning and things like that, where, they might be looking at, we have another tool called Advanced Cluster Manager that does, cluster provisioning and so forth. So they're starting to look at those types of things. But I would say it's an iteration, for at least like customers that are halfway through the maturity curve for now. Yeah.
And speaking of GitOps, Guide to the Galaxy starts at the top of the next hour. So please stick around for that if you're interested.
Yeah, we've got what, five more minutes left?
Yeah.
I'm actually all out of questions for John. I thought it's been a good discussion. I don't know, John, if you had more you wanted to talk about.
I hadn't even looked at our notes, actually. So it's
which is good. No, I think we covered everything.
Yeah.
Nice.
Well, let me throw this up again real quick.
Okay.
For those who didn't see it at the beginning of the show. So again, this was one of our 2 OpenShift TV shows for the month. We do this every month. This month is on compliance. The next show is actually tomorrow with Stig. So tune in there. That'll be a good one. We're also going to be producing 3 podcasts around compliance as well. Because of Summit next week, they might actually bleed into being dropped in May. So just stay tuned. But we've got a blog also being reviewed right now with some of the topics we talked about, and some other content as well that we're publishing. But this is the monthly security series. So
awesome.
For me, that's it. I really appreciate, John, you joining us today for this Thought Leadership DevSecOps is the Way show.
Cool. I appreciate everyone having me. Sorry, some of my responses tend to be long-winded, but we have a lot of fun here. So I like to anything I've been learning. I always like to kind of throw it out. So it's not one thing I don't do is hoard knowledge. So
we appreciate that for sure.
Yeah. So, but if there's any questions in the chat or something,
not a lot of questions other than how would I do X with Z, Y, and I've answered most of them basically.
Okay.
So
I
mean the biggest thing is reach out if you need us. We're here to help you. If you're having compliance issues within your organization, let us know. We can help.
Absolutely. Osbourne at redhat.com, or I'm OpenShift Fed on Twitter. So reach me anywhere.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Appreciate it. Dave, I'll see you tomorrow.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Dave. Great chatting with
you
guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Stay safe, everyone.
All right.